So this is 1 Peter 3:13 through 22. 1 Peter 3:13 through 22. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear. Do not be frightened. But in your hearts, set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. It is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive by the Spirit, through whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who disobeyed long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a good conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand, with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him.
Last week, we looked at chapter 2 in 1 Peter, and we also considered the situation of the Christians that Peter was writing to, their social situation and political situation. These were fairly new converts to Christianity. They were living in Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, and they were living in a very hierarchical society, rigidly hierarchical. And in that society, foreign religions like Christianity were treated with a lot of suspicion and treated with a lot of actual hostility. And these new Christians were being ostracized by the people in that society, and probably many of them were being ostracized by their own families for sort of turning their backs on the faith of their families that they'd grown up with. And so into this situation, Peter speaks words of encouragement to these new Christians. In that passage from last week, he says, when you're undergoing these hardships, I want you to remember Jesus. He too was rejected by mortals. He was also actually rejected by many of his own people, and probably people in his own family. And in spite of that, he was chosen in God's sight. And the same is true for you. You are being mistreated, you're being slandered, but remember this, you are God's own people. You are in fact a royal priesthood, this is Peter's language, and you are a holy nation. And part of what makes that passage so powerful is that Peter was writing in part to groups of women and groups of slaves. And these were groups that had the least amount of power in that society. And so he is telling them, you are a royal priesthood, you are a holy nation, even though you're experiencing these hardships. And I imagine that his words gave them a real sense of dignity and a sense of hope and a sense of purpose. And today we continue with the lectionary schedule with a passage from chapter 3 that Fiera just read. But first I want to acknowledge that between last week's passage and today's passage are some of, in my mind, the New Testament's more controversial sections. And those passages have been abused and used against people who are suffering. So, for example, in those sections, Peter tells Christian slaves to accept the authority of their masters and honor those masters, even when those masters abuse them and treat them harshly. And then he goes on to tell women to accept the authority of their husbands. And I know that those passages bring up a lot of feelings. And I know that because there was a whole day this week where I walked around fuming about them as I was trying to decide if I was going to preach on them. And I considered focusing on those this week because, to be honest, it feels like a little bit of a cop-out to just skip over them, like the lectionary happens to do.
Does it go back in a different cycle?
It might in a different year, but I kind of doubt it.
So the lectionary doesn't make every single passage.
No. I did not choose to preach on those passages today, partly because, when you approach difficult sections like that, you want to do them justice, and I have 12 to 15 minutes. So it didn't seem like that would do them justice. So we will have to talk about them another time. But what I will say about those passages is that Peter was trying to find a way to counsel these new Christians in the situations that they are in. That was the life that they were living. He acknowledges their context, and he's grappling with how to live out Jesus's example in their context. And I think he probably knows that lashing out would not change their situations, probably make things worse for them. But on to today's passage. Like I said last week, Peter is encouraging these Christians by drawing a comparison between their situation and Jesus's situation. So again, he said, "You have been rejected by the world, but you are chosen by God." And he continues this line of thought throughout the rest of the letter. And so his next question becomes, so what does that mean for how we should behave in our lives? How should we act, right? How should we respond to this mistreatment that we're experiencing? Well, he begins our passage today by saying, "Do not fear what they fear. Do not be intimidated by them. Instead, in your hearts, sanctify Christ as Lord." And that conviction that Christ is Lord, that conviction, which sounds very simple, it actually reframes for them the entire Roman system. So he's saying, despite what the Roman Empire tells you, the emperor is in fact not God. The emperor is not your ultimate Lord. And his power only goes so far. So you do not need, in fact, to fear the emperor himself, which is a pretty amazing statement. Then Peter goes on to give some very practical advice. Chris said it sort of resembles wisdom literature. So Peter says, keep your consciences clear, meaning treat everybody that you encounter with respect, including these people who are treating you like garbage. Don't insult the people who are insulting you. Do not give them fodder for speaking badly about you and other Christians. So if you're going to suffer, it's better for you to suffer for doing good things than it is to suffer for doing bad things. And then he sort of gives some theological grounding for this practical advice, and he starts talking about Jesus again. So he says, remember, Christ also suffered because of and on behalf of other people's sins. The righteous one suffered for the sins of the unrighteous and on behalf of the unrighteous. And this is my commentary, but clearly this is not fair and it seems wrong to us. It feels wrong when this happens. But Peter says, remember, this is actually what brought you yourselves closer to God. Jesus suffering on behalf of sins that he did not commit. And the way that this argument could go, I think it could make us a little bit queasy, because Peter seems to be implying that the suffering and the abuse that these Christians are experiencing could somehow be salvific in the same way that Jesus' suffering was, right? That it could actually be good. Why? Because it could have the power to bring their enemies closer to God. I'm not actually sure this is what Peter is intending to imply, but I think the dots are there to be connected. So he goes on to say that though Jesus was put to death in the flesh, actually the second half of this passage, I feel like gets a little weird. Bear with me. Peter goes on to say that although Jesus was put to death in the flesh, killed by the unrighteous, but he was made alive in the Spirit or through the Spirit. And then he kind of goes on this strange train of thought or argumentation. So he says that after being alive in the Spirit, Jesus then went on to preach the gospel to the spirits who are in prison, who in former times did not obey. And I think we assume that Peter's talking about humanity who lived before Jesus came to earth, who did not have the opportunity to hear the gospel. And he talks specifically about the times of Noah and the flood, and the few people who survived that flood. And he says that the water of the flood prefigured the waters of baptism, which is a sign of salvation. After thinking about this passage for the week, I have to admit, I have not made sense of this argumentation. But I do think it is related to this idea of redemptive suffering. Suffering on behalf of other people, including, and maybe even most, for our enemies. That through Jesus' suffering, right, through his death in the flesh, we get salvation and life in the Spirit. Or, how I tend to think about this is perhaps Jesus's willingness to suffer on behalf of others is the salvific part. And again, I know, like in our modern world, these ideas might make us cringe, right? That by extension, the suffering of these new, very vulnerable, weak Christians, that their suffering could have some sort of power or spiritual worth. And I think we all recognize that this line of thought can so easily slip into manipulation, or the acceptance or even the condoning of an abusive or evil status quo. People can use this idea against other people, right? While not taking that idea on for themselves. I know there are a couple people here who are interested in cults, like I am. And, it made me think of this particular cult leader who used this exact same logic against his adherents, right? I am making you suffer, but that just proves that you love me, right? And that is a very cynical use of this kind of theology. I do not think Peter is being cynical or manipulative here. For one, because tradition holds that Peter accepted this teaching for himself and was martyred. He accepted his own suffering on behalf of Jesus. And I also don't think Peter is glorifying suffering. Maybe the point isn't that suffering itself is powerful, but that God can redeem suffering and use it for something. That God can take something evil and transform it. That's one way to see the cross and the resurrection, right? As the redemption of humanity's evil and sin, kind of Jesus passing through that evil and coming out on the other side of it in an even more powerful and revelatory form. As I was considering all of this week and Peter's exhortation to the Christians in Asia Minor to endure suffering, I started thinking about our own country's history, and I started thinking about the civil rights movement, and particularly how Martin Luther King approached his work for justice. And I started to wonder, I wonder if there's any writing that Martin Luther King did about First Peter in particular. And his commitment to loving his enemies, right? Which I think is a more accurate way of describing pacifism or nonviolence. So I did a very quick Google search of First Peter and Martin Luther King. And boom, I think maybe the first result was part of a sermon that he preached on First Peter. Not exactly our passage, but it's from First Peter chapter 2. And I want to read that passage first. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that free from sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds, you have been healed, for you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and the guardian of your souls. So this is what Dr. King took from that passage. This is how he preached it. And I think you'll catch on to who he's speaking to. We shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we will continue to love you. Throw us in jail, and we will still love you. Bomb our homes, threaten our children, and we will still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our community at the midnight hour and beat us and leave us half dead, and we will still love you. But be assured that we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. One day we will win freedom, but not only for ourselves. We shall so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory. Wow, that is quite an example of accepting suffering, right? Not glorifying the suffering, but accepting it, passing through it, and coming out on the side of resurrection. This passage and this letter of First Peter, it's got me thinking a lot about our current atmosphere in our country, and how contempt seems to be the defining stance that we take towards our enemies, and it's encouraged. And that includes inside the church and outside the church. And it makes me really respect and yearn for a movement of for God's justice that is actually grounded in Jesus's example, grounded in the power of both the cross and the resurrection. And I hope that we can be a part of that kind of work, because it can be a revelation of God's power and God's love.